4 o'clock. Welcome to the Wednesday, February 12th, 2025 meeting of the Liberty Lake Planning Commission. We will do Pledge of Allegiance and then roll call. So would you please stand and join me in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We have a roll call, please, ma'am.
Joe Mann,
Here.
Tom Solberg,
Here.
Jim Bumker,
Here.
DG Garcia,
Here.
Charlie Jenks,
Here.
Dale Robbins,
Dale is in Seattle, in court hearing. He asked to be excused.
Phil Boyer, Gene Huschel.
Here.
And Troy Mullen.
Here.
Thank you.
So I hear a motion to approve the absences of Commissioner Foyer and who is moved Commissioner Jenks. Okay. Is there a motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve the absences.
Okay. Is there a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Review the agenda. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda for today? Motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve agenda.
Thank you, sir. Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next is minutes from January 22nd. Any changes or issues with the minutes from January 22nd?
Move to approve the minutes as written.
Thank you. Move to second. Thank you, sir. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Workshop, housing policy.
So I would like to introduce, first of all, can you hear me? Can you hear us, Sharifa? I would like to introduce Sharifa Abdul Salam, Jennifer Shuck, and Andrew Oliver from FCJ Alliance and Leland Consulting, who are teaming together to support us in our housing. And with that, I'm going to stop my share and let Sharifa share her screen.
Thank you, Lisa. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. As Lisa mentioned, we are working on helping the city with the development of the housing policy. And as part of this work, we started a general review of the existing regulations and comparing it to state legislation and some of the resources provided by Commerce. And we're going to walk through that today. But before we dive into that, I just wanted to give you an overview. I mean, Lisa presented the three of us. So I'm from FCJ Alliance, and then we have Andrew and Jennifer from Leland Consulting. And a short overview of who FCJ Alliance is. We are a Washington-based company. We have multiple disciplines, including planning. We were founded in 2006 with 6 people and grew to almost 140 people right now, over 10 different offices, 6 of which are in Washington State, including 1 office in Spokane, which is the closest to you all. We have a variety of types of projects that we focus on within our planning field at FCJ Alliance. We mostly work on comprehensive plans, including their housing elements. We work on zoning codes and regulation updates. We do a lot of public engagement events, as you see in some of the pictures on the right-hand side. And generally, we do on-call services that includes support with all of these items, which is what we're doing for the city of Liberty Lake. When we submitted our proposal for the on-call services, we gave you all this chart that gives you just an overview of an example of some of the projects that we've worked on recently, including comprehensive plans, engagement materials, GIS mapping, zoning codes and development regulations, and the cities at the very bottom, some of the cities that are currently we're working with for on-call services. And with that, I'll pass it on to Leland to give a brief overview on what they're doing and then jump right in.
Hi, so Leland Consulting Group is a team of strategic advisors based in Portland, Oregon, focused on urban real estate, economic development, and public-private partnerships. We work on the housing and economic development chapters of comprehensive plans throughout Washington. We have a list here of all of the cities that we've worked in recently and are currently working in. And the analysis we're going to talk about tonight is part of the work that we typically do in these communities. And we're excited to be here to present today.
Yeah, and before we go into the first section we're talking about, I do want to invite all of you to ask questions throughout this session. This is intended as a workshop, not a presentation. So at any point, feel free to stop us and ask a question and we can discuss it right then and there. And all right, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Great. So I'm going to talk about the adequate provisions checklists. Next slide. So under HB 1220, states require that jurisdictions make adequate provisions for existing and projected housing needs for all economic segments. The checklists are provided by the Department of Commerce. We filled those out. They should be in your packet this afternoon. And the purpose of these checklists is to document programs and actions that could help remove barriers to building different types of housing in the community. It's important to note that these checklists are not, for the most part, they are intended to be, recommendations for the city as you're going through the housing policy updates. You have context as city leaders that, we may lack, and you may look at some of our recommendations and say that doesn't fit with us here, and that's totally fine. The idea is just to identify those barriers, make suggestions about how those barriers could be addressed, and then have that as a jumping off point for conversation for you all. The one exception to that is the accessory dwelling unit review. We're helping you make sure you're in compliance with HB 1337, which is state requirement. So the checklist that we completed were the moderate density housing, which includes things like duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, that kind of missing middle housing typology, low-rise and mid-rise housing, which is your more traditional apartment buildings, permanent supportive housing, and emergency housing, the accessory dwelling units, as I mentioned earlier, and then we went through some local option tools, which are different tools that cities can use to promote affordable housing. I'm not going to go line by line through every checklist, so I'm going to hit the highlights so we can move on to more exciting topics. So as far as moderate density housing, that Spokane triplex in the top right-hand corner is a housing typology that is already allowed in Liberty Lake, those kind of side-by-side middle housing or moderate density housing units. So some of the barriers we looked at are really just about making the code a little bit more flexible to allow for a wider variety of middle housing typologies. Some of our key recommendations around density, we recommend considering increasing the max density in the R2 zone to 16 dwelling units per acre. That I know can sound like a lot, but it is a typical density for something like a townhome or moderate density housing. As far as off-street parking, it could be worthwhile to tie the number of parking spaces to the number of bedrooms. So having more parking spaces for a 2-bedroom unit than for a studio unit, just again to allow for some of that flexibility. Within the design standards in the R3 zone, there is some patio and deck requirements, which as you build multi-story moderate density housing could become an issue. So that might be a barrier to look at. And then design review, I don't believe design review is required currently for this type of housing, but it's not, I think in the code, it says something like for large scale housing development. This is probably not what's meant by that, but just clarifying that would be really helpful. Next slide. For low and mid-rise housing, again, the same comment on parking. and then, and design standards as far as that patio and deck requirement, and the large scale housing design review, just clarifying when that would be allowed or when that would be required, potentially allowing some of these types of housing without that design review and saving that requirement for, exceptionally large properties. Next slide, please. So for permanent supportive and emergency housing, I know this is work that you're already doing in Liberty Lake. I think there was a city council meeting recently on some of these barriers. But under state law, there's some new requirements around removing any spacing requirements. So that means if there's, there has to be at least 1,000 feet between shelters. With transit proximity in Liberty Lake, that could also be a barrier. So just making sure that both permanent supportive and emergency housing are not subject to those types of rules. Parking, a lot of times in these types of developments, the residents who live there don't have access to vehicles. So there could be opportunities to lower the parking requirements. Some of the zones where this type of housing is allowed, it seems like office use isn't allowed. And a lot of times support services are an important part of these developments. So making sure that in conjunction with this type of housing, you're allowed to have some office space for support services. And then occupancy limits, again, are no longer allowed with the new RCW requirements.
Jennifer, could I jump in here for just a second
Yes.
before we go on to the next slide? So I just wanted to bring to the Planning Commission's attention, we fixed this in terms of emergency housing. The second read is happening on Tuesday, so that is going to be adopted. We needed to do that so that we could finish our land capacity analysis. And be able to demonstrate that we could meet the housing requirements. We put a pin in this one. The same things are going to need to happen for the supportive housing. However, the permanent and supportive housing, however, it wasn't required at that time, and we said that we would address this through the other code requirements. But I do want to point out that that we do need to do the same thing in terms of spacing requirements, in terms of occupancy limits, and we may want to look at the transit piece as well.
I have a question. So is what we ran through with you that you just described, my recollection of that doesn't really comport with what these folks are proposing. We may have a conflict.
So what we went through in terms of emergency housing, there were some changes to code or to the RCWs that we had to address in order to even complete the land capacity analysis, which is the foundational piece for the comp plan. We recognized at the time, and I mentioned this to this body, and I just wanted to bring it back to your attention, that we were going to have to revisit this with permanent supportive housing also, but that it wasn't required at that point, and that we would deal with it with all the other housing amendments that we need to make. So I just want to really underscore the fact that this is one that we have to do.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry, Jennifer.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. Okay, and then accessory dwelling units, again, this is just making sure that the city code is compliant with HB 1337 requirements. As far as parking, the requirements say that you should account for distance from transit and lot size. And then the only additional thing that we wanted to bring up was design standards, again, allowing for more flexibility of ADUs. There are a lot of different types of ADUs that can be in different configurations, and allowing for a wider variety would open up more opportunities. So Liberty Lake already expects to raise about $50,000 annually from its housing and related services tax. And that's, not enough to fully subsidize an affordable housing complex, but could, help with infrastructure needs or other parts of affordable housing developments, that's great. Some other tools that you could consider to increase the viability of affordable housing would be things like impact fee waivers or application fee waivers. And yeah, that's all I got for now.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we're going to follow what Jennifer went through with sort of a restructuring of all the information that she's provided. So that Jennifer just went through information as structured by the adequate provisions checklists provided by Commerce. So we took that information, did a thorough review of the existing code regulations, and looked at all of that together and grouped these different items based on the different zoning or areas within the regulations that we can focus on. So we're not going to focus on housing type, but we're going to focus on the area within the code that this thing falls under. So we'll talk about the barriers altogether first, and then we'll talk about the regulatory opportunities, and we'll talk about those with more specificity than what we just covered. Before we dive into regulations, we do want to notice that within Liberty Lake, there are some environmental constraints, primarily in the form of topographic constraints. So typically for any type of development, ideally you want the land slope to be between 0 to 15%, no more than 15%. Once you get in the 20% slope or higher, now you need a little more engineering, you need specialized construction tools, you need different types of foundations, your erosion likelihood is way higher. So even maintaining buildings post-construction can be costly. So all of that means anything built in areas that are steeper slopes than 20% becomes costly not only to build, but also to maintain. And a lot of the areas with open land available for housing development right now, like in Legacy Ridge West, Bella Lago, and other areas within the city, have slopes of steeper than 30%, which is considerably steeper than that 15% typical that you want, making these areas more expensive to develop and therefore less likely to become affordable for housing options in the future. So this is one type of environmental constraint that already exists within Liberty Lake. The ones that we can control more are the regulatory constraints that we're going to look at. So we'll dive into a little deeper detail into the regulations that Jennifer just covered. And you'll see that certain ones will have an asterisk next to them. Those in this section are in direct conflict with new state legislation. So the ones that have an asterisk next to them means that they are things we must change and address in order to comply with state legislation. And again, I invite you to ask questions with any item that I'm going to go through right now. So the first area that we're going to cover is regulations relating to zoning and density. So first bullet point you see at the top, right now, as Jennifer mentioned, the R1 zone does not allow housing types like duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, even though the city allows attached homes up to 4 units, which is very similar to fourplexes or triplexes or duplexes, which are only 2 units that are attached. In addition, state legislation requires that we allow duplexes in all residential zones. So that is something that we must apply into the code that is currently restricting housing options and availability within Liberty Lake. The second item is that the one that Jennifer mentioned, which is R2 zone currently allows for 12 dwelling units per acre. But when you look at what is typically associated with moderate density housing, it's more of 16 units per acre. So just increasing that a little bit opens up more flexibility for developing housing types like townhomes within the different zoning districts. Regarding supportive and emergency housing, this is what we were talking about and what Lisa was covering in terms of the spacing. The current code language says, hey, the different facilities must be apart by 3/4 of a mile, and they all have to be within a 1/4 mile from a transit stop. This becomes very restrictive on the areas available for such facilities. So this is all going to be revised, as Lisa mentioned already. Regarding ADU restrictions within the zoning areas, currently, Liberty Lakes zoning code only allows for one ADU per lot. The state legislation requires us that we allow two for tier 3 cities, which Liberty Lake is a tier 3 city. Secondly, ADUs are currently prohibited with multifamily developments or duplexes. So if we start allowing duplexes in R1 zones, do we want to also allow ADUs to be developed with them? And to be completely transparent, this is not required that we allow ADUs with duplexes, but it is another option of expanding housing availability within the city across the different zoning districts. Right now, ADUs and the existing regulations, you can only build them if the primary unit is larger than 1,200 square feet in area, and you can only build a detached ADU unit if your lot is larger than 8,000 square feet. All of these restrict the lots where you can build ADUs and are in direct conflict with the state legislation that states if your lot size is compliant with the underlying zone, you must allow the 2 ADUs per lot. Whether they're attached or detached, similar to the graphic that Jennifer was showing, you have different configurations. Could be under a building, could be on top of the building, on top of the garage replacement. You have a lot of variety, but you just must allow the 2 ADUs per unit if your lot is compliant with the underlying zone. Additional existing restrictions on ADUs regarding their sizes and occupancy. Currently, Liberty Lakes Code says your ADU size cannot be larger than 35% of the main unit size or 900 square feet, whichever is smaller. And this is in conflict with state legislation because it requires that you cannot have a ADU requirement, maximum requirement that is smaller than 1,000 square feet. And I know we're talking about maximum and smaller. It sounds a little conflicted, but we can't require ADUs to be smaller than 1,000 square feet. People can opt to build ones that are smaller, but the code cannot require them to be any smaller than 1,000 square feet. So we can raise that 900 square foot to 1,000 square foot in order to comply with state legislation. Some cities are opting to allow even larger ADUs, but that's a flexibility in the range that you can allow and choose based on what's more appropriate for Liberty Lake, as long as it's not smaller than 1,000 square feet. Another point that is currently in Liberty Lakes Code that is in conflict with HB 1337 is the occupancy requirement for the principal unit. The current code says you can only build an ADU if the primary unit is owner occupied. The new state legislation says you cannot require the primary unit to be owner occupied for you to build an ADU and rent it out. All right, moving on to off-street parking requirements, and we're going to talk about those for the variety of housing types. So as Jennifer mentioned, right now the multifamily homes, including the smaller types, all require the same number of parking spaces per unit, regardless of your unit size or the number of bedrooms. So you require 1.75 parking space for a studio apartment and a 1.75 space for a 3-bedroom apartment. So it's worth revising the code to make it corresponding with the unit size or number of bedrooms. The state legislation also requires that for middle housing, namely duplexes, because that's what's required explicitly for Liberty Lake and for ADUs, those need to correspond to the proximity of transit. So if you're within a half a mile from a transit stop, you cannot require minimum parking for duplexes or for ADUs. So that's something that needs to be revised in the code to meet the requirements from the state legislation.
Sharifa, we've got a question here.
Question,
Go ahead.
do you have to have requirements for parking?
Per the state legislation, you don't, but that's a city preference.
You don't have to, but and many communities are moving away from parking minimums, and that works in a very urban setting where you have robust transit. It's a little bit more challenging in a community that is.
And then, can you charge extra for units with parking?
That's market driven.
Yeah, but I mean, there's no state law that says you can't do that. Okay. Okay.
No, and where places have gotten rid of or reduced minimum parking requirements, some developers will still choose to build more parking.
Yeah, more money.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then finally, the one that we touched on is the supportive and emergency housing currently are required to provide half a parking space per bed and then one space per employee. And as Jennifer mentioned, most residents in those places do not own a car, don't have access to their private vehicles. And this creates a burden in terms of this space usability for such facilities, especially when we're trying to encourage building those closer to transit.
So again, same question for supportive housing. Do you have to require or do you have to provide parking?
No, state regulation does not require you to require parking. These are usually just for cities to control parking and understand, depending on their availability for on-street parking.
Okay.
All right. Moving on to regulatory constraints related to design standards and the review processes within Liberty Lake. So we mentioned the patios. Right now, all the moderate density housing are required to provide 35 square foot patio for all ground floor units and for 75% of the upper floor units. And this just adds a layer of burden. We know the intention of this is to provide high quality design and better quality living and some sort of private open space. But this can be a restriction that makes it less feasible to provide housing that is more affordable, especially for smaller units, because the size of this open space does not take into consideration the size of the actual housing unit itself. So this is what makes it more of a restrictive requirement. Currently, multifamily housing and mixed-use zones all require a commercial component regardless of the demand. So if we look at certain areas where there is a lot of demand for commercial, this might make sense, but in areas that are more neighborhood oriented, you may be able to get away with just residential buildings that do not have a commercial component or some sort of a flexibility in dealing with that commercial component. So that's one thing to think of, just to avoid having space that sits vacant, and then developers are less encouraged to build in those areas. We talked a little bit, Jennifer touched on that there are currently some design requirements for ADUs, so we'll talk a little bit about what those are in the code. So currently, if you want to build a detached ADU on your lot, you have to build a 6-foot tall fence to conceal it from the street. And the intention with that is to preserve the single family neighborhood aesthetic. So that's one additional burdensome, say, requirement that you have to build if you want to do a detached duplex. ADUs, sorry. Additionally, ADUs are required to have a pitched slope roof with a slope of at least 4 and 12. And that's okay, but you don't require this for your single family homes or other types of housing. So this is just a restrictive requirement that's only applied to ADUs in the residential areas and to manufactured homes, which have a sloped roof requirement of 3 to 12. So that these are additional design requirements that are worth looking into, and in terms of revision, just increasing the flexibility and the design of these spaces. Additional design review constraints is for manufactured homes right now, they are required to be multi-sectional or double width with a minimum area of 1,000 square feet. This limits the option of developing smaller ones that can be even more affordable, and more importantly, the whole area of developing tiny home communities. So right now, the code does not allow for that. So just thinking of expanding the options and removing those minimum requirements so we can allow for more affordable options to be developed within Liberty Lake. And then we touched on the occupancy requirements right now for supportive housing. It's limited to 20. The staff are limited to 20, and the residents are limited to 40, regardless of the size of the facility, regardless of the size of the lot. So these are considered arbitrary limitations on occupancy, and they are not allowed by state law. So we need to revise those to align with the required state legislation. And then finally, for the design review and processes, we have the requirement of the design review for all developments in mixed-use areas. So potentially just looking at that and making it a more streamlined process, so there is less risk and less cost associated with the review processes for buildings. Finally, the last item that we'll talk about in terms of the regulatory constraints existing within the current code is the existing restrictions on office uses within certain residential areas. So if we want to say build a permanent supportive housing or emergency housing facility in an R2 zone, we have to go through a conditional use permit for us to just allow supportive services within that housing complex. And we all know the importance of pairing those complexes with the services that are required. So ensuring that the code does not restrict the use of office space when built in conjunction with these facilities, regardless of which zoning district they're built within. So these are the existing outlined regulatory constraint that we were able to find within Liberty Lakes law. So now we're going to move into what opportunities we have. So similarly, we'll focus those opportunity into the different buckets of areas. So we'll talk about opportunities in the zoning and density area. We'll talk about the design and development standards, permitting processes, parking requirements, and then PSH and emergency housing standards. Now, wherever you see this asterisk, this means that this is required. This proposed change or opportunity is required by state legislation. So it's really more than an opportunity here, it's more of a requirement. So we looked at all these constraints within Liberty Lake, and we looked at some resources from Commerce. So Commerce has a guidance for developing your housing policy. That's the name of the guidance document. And they also have a housing action plan guide, which is the HAP that you see on these slides. It's referring to that housing action plan document. So within these two documents, they have a set of proposed strategies for cities and communities to adopt and utilize to guide their housing policy development. So we looked at the policies and strategies provided in those and compared them to the restrictions that we identified for Liberty Lake and started to propose ideas to change the policies moving forward based on those strategies outlined in these documents. So the first strategy that we looked at in the housing action plan talks about increasing the allowed housing types in existing zoning districts. So for example, we talked about allowing duplexes in R1 zones. So that's a requirement. And in the state legislation, they talk about the 2-unit configuration beyond just duplexes. So they also talk about having 2 cottage houses, or they call them a courtyard apartment if they're attached and you have a shared open space, or stacked units if the duplex is, instead of side by side, they're on top of each other. So all of these options of a 2-unit configuration must be allowed in the R1 zone. So that's per state legislation. And then additionally, one thing that we touched on a little bit earlier is allowing tiny home communities or co-living developments in certain areas. For example, if you have mixed use districts or neighborhood mixed use, these might be nice opportunities, or even R2, to allow some co-living opportunities or tiny houses. The benefit of these types of development is that they have a lot of shared amenities. And when you share these amenities, you distribute the cost of these amenities across multiple units, as opposed to having these amenities per each unit, which reduces the overall cost of developing them and renting at these locations. The next strategy that we looked at from the Housing Action Plan Guide is to increase or remove density limits. So we talked about increasing that density limit in R2 from 12 to 16 to align with the more typical density required for moderate housing. And then the allowing of 2 ADUs per lot as opposed to 1 ADU per lot. And that's again per state requirement, which is why you see the star next to it. And then this is a suggestion for the community to think about and the city to think about is, do we want to allow ADUs to be built with duplexes? Because we know we're going to allow duplexes across R1 zones. So do we also want to allow ADUs within the same zone with duplexes? And I don't know if anybody wants to comment on this or if we just want
Yeah,
to move on.
we've got somebody here.
I have
Okay.
2 questions, but the topic you were just talking about, are there other cities similar size to Liberty Lake that you guys have found that do allow the ADUs to be built with the duplexes?
I would say the tier 2 cities are more likely to go that route. Most tier 3 cities, which are similar in size to Liberty Lake, are opting to either allow the duplexes or the ADUs, and that's what the state legislation requires of these cities.
Okay.
But, if there is an appetite for that, it doesn't limit that option. Commerce is very explicit about that this is an option for tier 3 cities to allow for ADUs along with duplexes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious, Liberty Lake's kind of unique in a way, and I don't see that fitting in here, but it was just interesting. That's the
Yeah.
and
One thing,
city is different.
yeah, one thing to note, and the way that Commerce tries to encourage and push for cities to allow for more housing availability by including ADUs with duplexes is that they say your code must require, like for the your duplex and your single family home. So if you have 2 lots, one has a single family home and one has a duplex, you can have the same sizing requirement, footprint, height, and all of that. So theoretically speaking, on the outside, they look like a single family home, both of them, but you have the option to provide more housing unit. It's more about how many housing units per lot you have. So that's more of a density choice for the city to reflect on. But it's fair that most tier 3 communities that we've worked with are opting for ADUs only with the single family house.
Okay, that makes sense. And then the other question that I had, and this is just a generic question, can HOA, since we have so many HOAs here, disallow duplexes in the R1 zone, even though state law is requiring it? I don't know how that works with HOA authority. So even if in our code it says that it has to be allowed because that's what state law is requiring us to do, can HOAs say, well, we don't allow duplexes in our neighborhood?
Sharifa, I've actually researched this one a little bit. And so my understanding is that an existing HOA can have CC&Rs that prohibit that. But a new HOA, new CC&Rs have to be in compliance with this state law. What I don't know the answer to, and I don't think that anybody knows the answer to this until somebody tests it in the courts, is when you have a new phase, so River Crossing East 6th edition, does that 6th edition have to have CC&Rs that are in compliance as opposed to just joining the existing CC&Rs? And so I don't know the answer to that, but I do know I do know that new CC&Rs need to be in compliance.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
Well, but I'm just gonna speak to the river crossing area since I'm on that HOA. And we've had discussions about this, and there's the CC&Rs, unless they're revised, are the same for the entire development. And so for the main, not for the others, because there are some that have additional amenities. We're intending to continue with our CC&Rs and make amendments to them as need be.
And that's how I would read that. That's how I would read that ordinance, but or that regulation. But as I said, until somebody tests it in court, I don't know that we know that's the case.
I have a question with regard to duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes on a lot. Let's say Joe owns a lot and he wants, instead of building a single family home, wants to build a duplex. And he comes into the city, and for the purposes of transferring interest in the property, he does a condominium property regime for the duplex. So he sells one unit to Betty and the second unit to Joe. How do you, and this is part of an established subdivision that it is platted for, let's say, 100 lots. Well, instead of now having one unit on the lot, you've now got 2 units on the lot. The subdivision was designed for 100 units. The water lines, the sewer lines, the electrical power system, the parks that serve the community were based upon a certain yield. Now you're increasing the yield for every person that makes that decision to build because they feel like they need to help the state solve the affordable housing crisis. They decide to build a duplex instead of a single family home. You're now increasing the burden on infrastructure, be it parking, water, sewer, electrical systems. How do you compensate for that, or can you? It doesn't seem to me as though you can. I mean, you're just kind of stuck with what you got.
It's a fair question. I think that because the lot size doesn't change, what you end up with are 2 smaller units. It's 2 smaller units with presumably that can support a lesser number of people in each unit, potentially. But at the end of the day, the regulations, the RCWs say that we shall at least allow duplexes. What I will say though, and I want to say this, I want to really underscore this point. We do allow attached single-family homes up to 4 units. From a massing perspective, from a design from the street, those 4 attached single-family homes look exactly the same as a fourplex or a townhouse. Yeah, yes.
Is that because we exert some design pressure on the builder?
No, it's just allowed in the R1 zone, and some builders do that, some do not. You'll see that the River District was based on their development standards are actually even provide for even a wider range of housing types and mixed together a variety of housing types. So you get small apartment complexes. You get even 6plexes, 4plexes, townhomes. It's a variety of housing types, and it does work. At the end of the day, we need to amend our code to allow at least duplexes. I would respectfully suggest that the Planning Commission at least consider the concept of going up to 4plexes, because it's consistent with what we already allow if they are attached single-family homes. And again, this goes back to something, and those of you who've been on here long enough have heard me say this over and over again. Ownership has no place in a zoning code. And that's really, so if it's attached single-family or it's a fourplex, the only difference may be in the ownership model, or there may be no difference at all.
Well, the issue is the number of units you end up with. I've worked in jurisdictions where the idea of ADUs seemed to be a good idea when it was included in the code, but then you end up with projects that are almost like rabbit warrens. I mean, end up with parking issues on the street. Definitely you have infrastructure issues you got to deal with. It's not a pretty picture when you get down the road a ways. It just doesn't work.
And I would agree. So we allow ADUs in all zones, in all residential zones right now. We haven't had a lot of demand for it. Yes, we do have some barriers. I don't think that's the reason why we haven't seen a lot of it. Actually, probably the bigger barrier is the water and sewer connection fees because there is no break for an ADU when it comes to connecting to the sewer and water. And that's not within our control. If we were the water and sewer purveyor, we would not be able to charge those fees. But right now, the Growth Management Act does not apply to the sewer and water purveyors. I know.
In that issue, if it doesn't apply to the water, how about taxing? Are the ADUs taxed differently than a single family unit? They better be.
Well, I think that they're taxed based upon their assessment. I think that in terms of, and again, building permit fees are based upon the valuation of the unit. So obviously size plays a big part in that. The city does have the opportunity to look at the concept of potentially waiving or reducing permit fees for ADUs or for affordable housing. Maybe they could even tie it specifically to the affordability of the housing.
Well, in that sense, on an ADU, would an ADU be owned by a different person than who owns a
Well,
single
that's
family?
one of the things that our code right now, and I've long ago said it's not enforceable. The provisions that that the primary unit has to be owner occupied. That's not an enforceable. It's not an enforceable code requirement, and I've said that for years. Now the RCW say we must remove it. So there's even a step further on this. There's actually a requirement that we allow for unit lot subdivisions. And what that effectively is if you have a home with 2 ADUs, that you could actually divide that into 3 lots. Yeah, so that's another requirement that we're going to have to grapple with in our development code this time around. So again, there's a lot of things that we have choices in, and but there's a lot of things that we have to do. One of the things I'm thinking is that at our next workshop, I might actually take you through, these are the ones that we have to do. So let's set those aside. We're going to do that. Here's the ones that are optional. Do we want to consider this? Do we want to consider that? And come up with a list that is Liberty Lake centric. This is what we think makes sense for our community. We do have to tackle some of these barriers. And I think having a robust conversation on the ones that are optional, I think goes a long way towards trying to figure out what fits for our community. But some of it,
Are our consultants going to be coming to Liberty Lake and viewing it personally at some point?
Alicia is on the team. Alicia Ayers is on the team. So
She's already there.
she lives here.
Yeah.
Well, one other thing too to remember is property taxes are based on parcels. So an ADU unit on the same parcel wouldn't be taxed separately. It would be taxed as an enhancement or an improvement to the primary parcel, but the parcel owner is the one that pays the taxes.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I do want to speak to something that you mentioned, Lisa, and I've heard from several people, is the option of selling a unit as a condo versus subdivision. These two are separate things. So subdivision is actually dividing the lot itself into 2 lots, and selling something as a condo is keeping the lot as a single lot, But for example, just selling your ADU, so the ADU is owned separately and you have some shared space for people to park and just walk through the unit to get to their ADU and so on. And it is a requirement by state law to allow that for the duplexes. So you must allow the duplexes to be owned separately, either by selling them as condos on a shared lot or by subdivision. So that is a requirement that the city will have to incorporate into their code.
Absolutely, and actually, we don't regulate condominiumization at all, if that's a word, at all. We, in the state deals with, condominium subdivisions. The city does not. And and I find that interesting. I'm not sure if that's true everywhere in Washington, but in the communities that I've worked in Washington, typically that's just done.
Do you review the applications?
No,
You don't even get any review.
we don't have any review on
That's
condominiumization.
crazy.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
anyhow, so my apologies. Back to you, Sharifa.
Yeah, no worries. Great conversation. Okay. Moving on to strategies for the design and development standards. So we talked about the ADU standards themselves. So we said the minimum allowable maximum is 1,000 square feet. So we can't require ADUs to be any smaller than 1,000 square feet. If we want to put a ceiling on it, it has to be 1,000 square feet. And then we suggest removing the ADU standards like building the 6-foot fence or the roof slope. And then we must allow ADUs to be built on all lots that are compliant with the underlying zone. So if the R1 zone has a minimum lot standard, regardless of if that's smaller than 8,000 feet or not, the current code says 8,000 for you to build a detached ADU. We can't require that anymore. If the lot is compliant with the underlying zone, we must allow them to build 2 ADUs in any configuration they want, detached, attached, and so on.
And Sharifa, if I may comment, have no minimum lot sizes. That's number one. Number two, the RCWs actually say that we can't have any design standards associated with the ADUs that are more restrictive than what we require of single-family homes. So if we don't require fencing and screening for single-family homes, we actually can't require the fencing and screening for ADUs. Same thing with the pitched roof, et cetera.
You're right. And that is also applicable for the duplexes. So we cannot require any design guidelines that are more restrictive for duplexes than we require for single-family homes. We can relax them more if the city chooses to, but they cannot be more restrictive for the middle housing units than they are for the single-family units. All right, so we talked a little bit about the ground floor retail. So maybe there are opportunities within certain mixed-use districts where the city wants to revise or provide a little more flexibility in the requirements for ground floor retail space. If there isn't so much demand for it in a specific area, we suggest neighborhood mixed use because those are more local oriented and you could have just apartment buildings next to mixed use buildings, and that could work really well. But that's optional for the city to reflect on.
And Sharifa, if I can just mention that, again, that is core in the River District, core to the River District regulations that they allow. That's how the little commercial center across from Orchard Park was developed as a neighborhood retail center. It is one of those new urbanism concepts that really is placemaking because people can suddenly walk to their to the neighborhood commercial areas and whatnot. So that's, I just want to point that out. The other thing, the flip side of that is that in our mixed use zones, not River District, but our other mixed use zones, we have a 1-to-1 requirement. 1 square foot of commercial to 1 square foot of residential. That doesn't make, one of the reasons why we haven't seen any vertical mixed use anywhere in the city other than in the River District where they don't have that requirement is that the typical for a vertically mixed use building is ground floor commercial with a couple stories of apartments above, but with the one-to-one requirement, it doesn't work. And so that's something that we should really consider also. And the commercial actually may help make the ground floor commercial may actually create a little bit more neighborhood, also make, provide an opportunity to kind of, reduce some of the costs associated with the residential because the commercial brings in, better revenue. Just a thought.
Great. Additional strategies related to design standards. We have the manufactured home. We talked about that a little bit when we were talking about the constraints. So removing the design standards such as the roof slope requirement, and then also the size requirement limitation. So if we allow multiple sizes, it means we open up the opportunity for building tiny home communities, which can be way more affordable than alternatives. Other design standards that did not have a directly related policy that's stated explicitly in the Commerce resources, but Commerce does encourage cities to look at policies that are more specific to the communities, is to modify the requirements for the balconies. We talked about that. So just potentially remove it or base it on the unit size so it's a little more flexible and adequate for developing a variety of housing types. And then relaxing the design and development standards for areas where we want to look for opportunities for adaptive reuse. Say we have office buildings, and then with the changing dynamics of how people go to the office, maybe we want to convert some of those units to residential, relaxing the design restrictions on those buildings to allow a less costly conversion of those to residential. That's one thing that is worth revising in the code, or just allowing more flexibility for those types of conversions. All right. Okay, we'll look at opportunities related to the review and permitting process. So generally speaking, the Housing Action Plan has a strategy that's just streamline your permitting process. One way of doing it is to remove any design reviews required for the R zones, for example. And then if we require any design review because we care about certain metrics, it has to be an administrative design review, so it doesn't go in front of a commission. It's just done with staff within just like the planning department of the city, just to streamline the process. Another thing that we touched on a little earlier because it was brought up is the subdivision process streamlining. So you can see a star next to this because for the middle housing, it is required that we allow for subdivisions for us to sell these units, have them owned separately, and this increases, it makes a more affordable home ownership opportunities for folks. And then if you don't subdivide the unit itself, again, just the condomization or condominiumization, that new word that we're going to be adding to our dictionary moving forward. Parking standards. So generally speaking, reducing the off-street parking requirements. One avenue of doing it is relating it to the unit size itself when we're looking at multifamily housing. And then for duplexes, the state legislation does specify based on the lot size. If your lot size is smaller than 6,000 square feet, you cannot require more than one parking space per housing unit. So if you do a duplex on a lot that is smaller than 6,000 square feet, you can only require one space per unit. The developer or the unit owner has the option to do 2 spaces if that's what they prefer, but the regulations, the code cannot require them to do more than 1 per unit if the lot is smaller than 6,000 square feet. If the lot is larger, then you can require up to 2 per unit. Middle housing and ADU units that are within half a mile from major transit stops, we cannot require any off-street parking for those, and that's per state legislation. So that is a requirement that we must adopt into the Liberty Lake Code. And then finally, one thing that we talked about earlier as well is adjusting the parking mandates for the supportive housing, permanent supportive housing, emergency housing, and other specialty housing facilities. Finally, additional opportunities that are specific to the permanent supportive housing and emergency housing is to remove the spacing requirements, and Lisa talked about that already, increasing or even removing altogether the proximity to transit requirement. And then one thing that we talked about a little bit as well is allowing office uses along with these facilities, regardless of which zoning district they're built in, to make sure that we provide a complete service for the residents of those facilities. And then finally, the one that is actually required by state legislation is to remove the arbitrary limitations on occupancy. So instead of just setting a number of 40, we go to just like a load per square foot as required in terms of health and safety standards. So we'll use that as a requirement to set the occupancy as opposed to just an arbitrary number. Finally, another thing that we talked about a little bit is to provide options for short-term rentals only in the context of, say, like a bridge home situation or transitional housing. So they are not like Airbnbs, they're not for recreational purposes or tourists, but you have to qualify for short-term rentals, and those can be programs to support temporary housing to help people get on their feet before they can move to permanent housing solutions.
Question. How do you define short-term rental housing? What term?
So there's actually, we've got state law that defines it as 30 days or less.
30 days or less?
Yes.
Okay.
And one of the things that I think that this is one that we really need to look at for some temporary and even some permanent supportive housing. They do, very often they will look at rental on a month-to-month basis, so that the 30 days. We have to be very careful in how we do this, however, because we want to be more explicit about the fact that we do not allow short-term Airbnb, Verba rentals. Yeah, thank you. We don't allow that, and we want to actually be more explicit in our code with regard to that. So we're going to have to be careful in the language so that if we want to consider the short-term rentals, which I think is an essential part of the concept of at least temporary supportive housing, and certainly maybe for permanent supportive housing as well, or transitional housing, excuse me. I just think that that's going to be, we're going to have to walk a tightrope on that one.
All right. Okay, with that, we covered the barriers to affordability and opportunities to address those barriers. And I'll move it back to Jennifer.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna take this one.
Oh, Andrew.
Hi everyone, thanks for having us. I'm going to talk a little bit about racially disparate impacts, the analysis that was in your packet, and how this fits into the comp plan update and recent legislation. So as part of HB 1220, along with other analyses that you have or will be hearing about, such as the income band, housing land capacity analysis, and the checklist that Jennifer presented earlier, there's a requirement that jurisdictions address zoning that may have had a racially disparate or exclusionary effect and address patterns of displacement. So there's Commerce has a book all about how to do this, and it's divided into these 5 steps that you can see here. Step 1, of course, is community engagement. And so in order to supplement that effort and look at some history and data, we have steps 2 and 3, which comprise the background analysis and the policy matrix that was in your packet, and I'm going to talk about here. And then these things feed into policies and regulatory updates through the comp plan process. So there's a great project that's been undertaken by Washington State to map parcels with racially restrictive covenants. These are parcels where the deed to the land says, that only people of a certain race can own the parcel. They're not legally enforceable and haven't been for a long time, but they still exist on a lot of parcels. And we looked at this data for Liberty Lake. As you can see, there aren't any in the city because the city was developed after the Supreme Court legislation, essentially. So there's still some vestigial ones here, as you can see, in Spokane Valley, but this is not a sort of a historical artifact that we have in Liberty Lake, contrary to a lot of other Washington cities. So we're looking at some data here. This is the race and ethnicity by census block group in the city. The dots are randomized in those orange census block groups that you see, and the dots represent different races and ethnicities. As you can see, there's not really anything that stands out. The city is pretty homogeneous racially, but the non-white populations are kind of distributed around more or less throughout the city, with possibly a little more diversity in the area there to the east of, in the center of town. It has some more multifamily housing. Looking at demographics, this chart shows only the non-white percentages in the city in blue and the county in yellow. So Liberty Lake, 93% white, a little bit less diverse than a few years ago, a little bit less diverse than the county, which is 84% white. There's the largest share of non-white residents in Liberty Lake are mixed race and Hispanic and Latino populations. The Hispanic populations increased in recent years, over the past 5 years, and there's been a slight decrease in Asian residents. Now we're going to look at some more housing specific things. So looking at cost burden, this is a term used by HUD, and it essentially is defined as a household that's spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs is considered to be cost burdened, and a household is considered to be severely cost burdened if they're spending more than half of their income on housing costs. So overall, as you see on this chart, there's a lot of blue. There's not a great deal of cost burden in Liberty Lake, which means overall, people in the city are able to more or less afford their housing for the most part. There's small levels of cost burden among white, Asian, and Native American households. The white households are the most likely to be cost burdened. This is also mostly just because most of the households in the city are white. So there's a wide degree of income spectrum across the population because it makes up over 90% of the population. Looking at tenure, that's renting or owning. So homeowners are in blue, renters are in yellow. Again, there's not a lot of huge differences, except we see the small share of Native American households in the city are likely to be all renters, at least according to the HUD data set here. Asian households are a little bit more skewed towards renters, and Hispanic and Latino households are primarily homeowners. So this is important to look at. The reason we're looking at these particular metrics is because renters can face different housing challenges, can face housing instability, eviction, raising of rents, which can have a more immediate and strong impact on housing security than homeowners, who generally obviously have more secure housing. So it's important to look and see if there are disparities in in tenure by race, which we don't see very much of here. All right, this looks at rental units in the city and the existing amount of units versus the incomes of households. So going from left to right, we have levels of AMI. That's essentially household income based on the area median income. So at the left, you have households that are very low income, extremely low income, earning less than 30% of the median income, and then 30 to 50, 50 to 80. On the right, you have households that are earning more than 80, and higher, so higher income households. So what you see here is kind of interesting. There's a small deficit of housing units affordable to the lowest income households in Liberty Lake, about 55 or so. I mean, there's margins of error on this, but essentially it's showing that, the cost burdened households that we saw in a couple charts ago are essentially these households that are earning less than 30% AMI, but there's not enough housing available. So they're having to pay more than they can afford in housing and rent some of these surplus units that are showing up in the mid-range of affordability. On the other hand, on the high end, we have a deficit of units as well. This is a little counterintuitive, but what it's essentially saying is that there are, 100 or so more households that, could afford, that are paying less than they could pay for housing, down renting essentially. So this means that they're renting units that are affordable to households that are making a little bit less. So this can take away some supply for households that are earning in those moderate incomes. So there's, what it really shows is a need for a wide variety of housing types across income levels to ensure that there's sufficient affordability in the community.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Seeing all this data is from 2017 to 2021. I take all of this with a huge grain of salt because it has changed dramatically in the last couple years, especially. Have you guys done comparative studies to, and I know you have to go off of something, but what it is now compared to what this data is showing? Because I would imagine it would be quite a bit different going off of actual numbers today as opposed to 2017 to 21.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It is a big detriment of this data set that HUD produces, that it's got quite a bit of a lag. This is the most recent data set from HUD that disaggregates all of these metrics by race and by these really specific income groups. I think, as part of the comp plan, there's going to be, or has been, I mean, Lisa or Sharifa can speak to this, some, updated housing needs, looking at current affordability levels. It may not replicate this chart exactly, but I would imagine that you guys will be doing some of that. I don't know if there's, but for this particular data set, like this breakdown is tricky to redo with more recent data, but we can definitely pull out, current incomes overall and current affordability of rental units from more recent real estate data.
Andrew, quick question.
Yeah.
This data is based upon census block groups, correct?
Yes.
So it doesn't have a clean clip to the city's boundaries.
Oh, no, it does. Yeah. This is based on the city boundaries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
My comment on that is 2017 data is almost worthless to us.
Well, it's from this CHAZ data set. So yeah, it's based on the American Community Survey. So it's census data that's, an average of recent surveys over a 5-year period. So it's not like point in time from any one of those specific years, but yes, it is old. And I think, it would be important to look at, and we can talk further about this, and about looking at some more recent affordability metrics.
It's like using 2017 gasoline prices.
Okay, a couple more slides here. So this is a map that we developed based on a methodology that the Department of Commerce developed, looking at social vulnerability. This is essentially looking at a weighted score of income, share of non-white populations, and share of renters, and each one of those compared to the county. So what you're seeing here is, on the scale of 0 to 15, there's a relatively low social vulnerability scores throughout Liberty Lake. A little bit higher in these areas in the middle of the city where we saw a higher concentration of multifamily housing, and but the areas with what the state in any way considers to be high vulnerability are like over 12 on this scale. So, this is part of the sort of overall look at displacement risk. That's part of this commerce methodology, and we're not seeing a high scores on this index here. Looking at incomes by race and ethnicity, again, there's some but not huge disparities. The Hispanic population is more likely to be above median income. Asian residents a little bit less so. White population, again, because it's the majority of residents, has a wider span range of income levels throughout Liberty Lake. And we did look at the next slide on where this matches up as well. So as part of that other map, one of the factors that went into that was median household income by census block group. So again, there is some, more wealthy and less wealthy areas of the city, as you can see here. But again, it's census data at the block group level. It's kind of hard to get down to this level of granularity, but it does paint a general picture of, where there may be some higher and lower income residents. So what does it mean? Okay. The population is 93% white. A lot of these metrics, as we saw, are not particularly skewed in race and ethnicity. So there's not higher rates of cost burden. There's not lower incomes overall among non-white residents, BIPOC residents of Liberty Lake. There are, a little bit of lower incomes and higher vulnerability score in some areas which have denser housing, also more renters there. So that also tracks with the data we've been seeing. But overall, this is not showing that there's either historical or current, strong disparities by race or ethnicity in the city. It does point to, another question, which is, looking forward into the future in this comp plan horizon, providing a wide range of housing types, sizes, affordability levels, is probably the most important thing to ensuring access to housing for all residents, regardless of race and income in the city. So
Okay.
I think there's
Question.
Yeah.
So the last bullet point, there may be barriers to people of color getting housing in Liberty Lake. I dispute that.
Yeah, I think, it was a sort of condensation of that thought I was trying to express there, that there are populations in the county that when we were looking at the county and city comparison data, for example, there are some more disparities there by race and ethnicity. And, if we're talking about rental housing availability and affordability and things like that, sometimes those do correlate on the larger scale, due to historic patterns of exclusion, et cetera, generational wealth and all that. So I think the idea behind that bullet was to sort of express that potential. But yeah, it could be phrased differently.
Is bullet 3 unique to Liberty Lake, or is that something you see generally in communities that could be an analog to Liberty Lake?
No, I don't think it's unique to Liberty Lake. Often, there are some such correlations, not always. I don't know, Jennifer, do you have some thoughts on that from other communities we've been working with?
Yeah, I would say that, in a lot of cases, areas with denser housing also have more rental housing. People who are in rental housing typically, make less than people who are able to afford home ownership. So it's not uncommon. It's pretty common in all of the cities that we worked in that that's the case.
Thank you.
Okay, yes. Thanks, Sharifa. I forgot there's one more slide. So the packet, the RDI matrix that is in your packet, I just wanted to briefly explain what it is and what it's for. We looked at some recent updates to goals and policies, and usually we go back to the previous comp plan, but staff have been making some preliminary updates to goals and policies here. in Liberty Lake, and we evaluated those against this criteria developed by this commerce methodology, looking at whether or not those goals and policies are supportive, approaching, or challenging impacts on racial disparities in access to housing. And so the recommendations or findings in that matrix are one of many things that are going to go into the goal and policy updates in the comp plan. One thing to note is that there is some discussion in Commerce guidance about avoiding certain discussions of neighborhood character because the term neighborhood character can, have can have implications about reducing access to neighborhoods, depending on how it's phrased and how it's used and what it means. Of course, communities want to preserve the things that are important to them, and that's not exactly what's in dispute or what Commerce is cautioning against, but there is some sort of emphasis on maybe rephrasing or specifying the things about neighborhood character rather than a general policy that refers just to neighborhood character in the abstract, in order to sort of ensure that it's not, it doesn't have a strong exclusionary undertone. So that's where we're at with the goals and policies as far as the racially disparate impacts. And of course, throughout the development of the element, there will be plenty of other goal and policy updates as a result of all the state guidance that Sharif has been talking about, and other necessary changes and changes that you want to see to the vision for your community.
And again, just similar to the adequate provisions, the goal and policy review that's part of the racially disparate impacts assessment is not, it's kind of a jumping off point for discussions among, you all and city staff to decide how you want to, address some of these barriers. There were not a lot of barriers that we found. Most of the policies that you all are working on are great. So just wanted to give you more context on that.
All right, with that, we'll talk about next steps. So we covered the barriers as we saw, and then discussed opportunities for them. So what we're doing right now behind the scenes is looking at everything that we explained to you all today and comparing it to the housing goals and policies in the housing policy as part of the comprehensive plan. Because as mentioned earlier, this is all part of our support to the city in developing the housing policy. So we're going to look specifically at the existing goals and policies and update those to align with the GMA, with countywide planning policies and the local vision for Liberty Lake, but ensuring that we are in compliance with state legislation. And then after we identify the goals and policies, we'll go into defining implementation strategies. So developing very clear metrics and strategies for us to effectively implement all the policies that we're proposing in the housing plan. And with that, that's the end of our presentation, and we can take any questions.
Thank you, Sharifa, Jennifer, and Andrew. That was great. We will be covering part 2 that Sharifa laid out, the next steps at our February 26th housing policy workshop. And we will be taking some time based upon your feedback at that session to take a first cut at a combined chapter for housing and community service. We said all along we were going to combine those two because it's necessary to do as we look at emergency and supportive housing, et cetera.
Okay.
And so we'll be looking at a first cut of that, hopefully in April, and trying to synthesize all the thoughts that I'm hearing from you guys and the feedback that we're getting from our consultants so that we can be kind of aligning with the comp plan and focused on what makes sense for our community. So thank you so much, all, and we'll see you couple weeks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So Lisa, if the next time we discuss this housing policy, you talked about coming in with a list of two lists, one that we can live with and one that is
We can-
are required.
We
by
can
state.
discuss, yeah, we can discuss, yeah. And so that's my game plan, is that I'm gonna try and break this down in a different format so that we can say, okay, this is what we gotta do, that'll just be in there. These are the things that we have to talk about, and we may need to have a third workshop on this to really do the drill down. And in fact, I told you that that's why this is constantly changing. In fact, you have a
Sure.
new one before you now.
Just a couple of questions before
Sure.
the next meeting on housing. Did these folks come out and spend some time in the community driving around and looking at the different areas?
Yes, and
And
they,
did they meet with the community and talk about what they were doing?
we have not yet. We're having these conversations now. We will then be using that as a basis for some community engagement. So that is, but we have to work through some of this in order to even begin to have conversations with the community. And we really need to get to a place where we're like, okay, this is what the state says we got to do. These are the things that we can have conversations about. So what we must do is an education piece, not an engagement piece. What we could do is an engagement piece, if that makes sense. So we're trying to parse that right now, and we've been talking about this for a number of meetings, and we're starting to get like a little more focused on exactly what that means and what that looks like. So it's going to take us some time.
Does the public have access to this document that we're looking at this evening?
Well, they do certainly because all of your packets are posted.
Okay.
My intent is that I'm going to send out this presentation tonight to all of you. We're also going to post it on our website. And I think there's good information in there. I think some of these, I'm hesitant to put too much jargony stuff on there because, on the website, because it's too much. But one of the things we are hoping to do is once we get a little farther along in our conversations, we have a better sense what direction you might like to go and what areas you might have questions for the public on, that then we can start focusing on an engagement piece. And we could talk more about what we have been doing, because I think that's going to kind of give you a feel for what we could do. And we do have a task order with SCJ Alliance that's just for public engagement. And so and they have done some cool things with that, but we kind of have to, we have to eat this elephant one bite at a time first. And then once we have kind of a direction that we think we need to go and have a better understanding of what we need to vet with the community, then we're ready to do engagement. So this is, and it's a slog. I have like three part document that's just guidance on housing from Commerce. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages.
Yeah.
I know it's overwhelming, and I apologize about that. So we've got about half an hour, and I've got a really quick update for you guys.
One more question.
Okay,
Is
sure.
it possible to get a copy of their PowerPoint?
Yes,
Yeah,
I just said that I was going to send that out to all of
Okay.
you. I didn't want to send it out to you in advance of the meeting because I wanted you to be able to hear it and ask questions.
Okay.
But yeah, it's my intent that will go out to you after the
Terrific.
meeting.
They did a good job of summarizing.
They did. They really did. And there is a lot to it. And again, that's why I'm trying to get you these packets early so that you have a chance to read and digest a little. And then again, it takes a couple times reading and digesting and noodling through this to kind of wrap your brain around, because it's a big shift.
Mhm.
It's a big shift, but we also, if we look at it from a community-wide basis, it's also a huge problem. And it's getting worse by the day. So with that,
Lisa,
yeah.
before you go into your presentation, I just have one more point that I want to make, what Gene and I were talking about earlier. I am very hesitant on a lot of the stuff that's being presented, especially if you said SRJ, was that the right?
CJ.
Yes, CJ, sorry. Going to start with this public engagement process. If we're making all these determinations on how we want to move forward and go about things, if this data is old and it's being presented to the public as old data, it's going to be skewed. And I know that what we were presented tonight is a very small portion of that. The point that I'm trying to make is that all of these other things that are going to be part of the public engagement, I would strongly encourage the data to be more up to date if at all possible. I know they have to pull something, but I thought that was a very poor example, what was presented tonight on what is actually going on, even if the implications for what we're going to be doing are small.
So this is what I gotta say. Number one, that's the best data that's available right now.
Mhm.
And given what's happening at the federal government level, I'm suspecting that we're not gonna, we would typically get the 2023 data this year. I'm now concerned that we may or may not see that data. It's the best data we have to work with. The data is not nearly as, there are boxes that we have to check here. We have to do the analysis to determine if there's any racially disparate impacts.
Mhm.
What I think it demonstrated is that there's not particularly.
No, that's what they said.
And
R-
so,
right.
so we have a couple policies that according to commerce guidance, we may need to tweak the wording on or be a little bit more specific as to what character means. As it relates to green infrastructure, walkable, bikeable infrastructure. We can better define what it is that makes Liberty Lake unique than just neighborhood character.
I completely agree.
And I agree with what you're saying too. My point being that while that might not be a point of contention for this particular example,
right.
I'm trying to see the more overall picture. If a lot of the stuff that's being presented in the future is based off of old data, it's going to be really hard for us to make those important decisions, because I would argue that housing affordability has completely changed in the last 2 or 3 years. And if we're going off of a 5-year guesstimate between 17 and 22, that's very old data and it's very skewed. And that's just one example.
I don't disagree. I don't disagree with you. And again, we're using the best available data to check this box.
Yeah.
And so this is
I know the boxes have to be checked. I know
this
they
is
got
the
to.
box we have to check.
Right, and they got to go off of some sort of data. I would hope that during that public engagement process, whatever we're a part of or whatever we're not, that is a point that is made at the beginning of the presentation, that this data could be very old, it could be skewed. So take it as you will.
I think
And this is the best data that's available. However, circumstances may have changed since this data was, compiled or whatever.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a very valid point. And again, I don't think that, I don't want to give you false expectations that I think we're gonna have better data. If we have better data, we will bring it forward. I just don't.
But the public needs to be aware of that, because
Absolutely.
most of them won't see that.
Declare the source and timing of the data
Right.
up front, so
Yep.
they
That's a very good
understand this is dated information.
Right.
Okay,
So
that's a very
that,
good.
that was all. Sorry. Continue.
So I just wanted to update you on some of the other things that are going on, and I just finished my community development report. Did I happen to mention to you that we've changed the name of our department to community development? Because we didn't have enough to do.
That's what it was originally, right?
It's like the Gulf
Yes.
of America.
Anyhow,
Here.
but you know what, I'm gonna actually, I wanna send out to you the community development report that we do for councils, because a lot of it has to do with a lot of what we're talking about here, as well as things that are coming up and the engagement pieces. I want you guys to be tuned into what we're doing. I'm gonna try and give you a brief update right now. Yes, sir.
Could we change our commission title then?
Yeah, Community Development Commission, that's exactly what I was gonna ask. With the CDC.
It's, we have to, okay, wait, we actually have to change city or municipal code though, if we're going to do that.
That's not.
Okay,
Remember,
thank
we
you.
were gonna do that earlier.
Anyhow, so comprehensive plan element update. I'm gonna just give you a really high level on a couple things that we're working on right now. City facilities master plan, which mostly is not us, but it's Mark McAvoy is working with Ben, our public works director, as well as with oh my goodness, Townsend Hury, to look at this. And this is kind of a moving parts and pieces thing. We also, we're about to let the contract for the Parks, Recreation and Open Space Plan, and I'll give you just a quick update on that. Transportation network analysis, as well as I just want to just share with you what we've been doing on public engagement and what's coming forward. A lot of balls in the air right now. So why does this not want to move? Oh, yeah. So first, the city facilities master plan. So on Tuesday, city council has a planned workshop to talk, we have a planned workshop where we look at city hall, library, police department, and what that looks like, what our needs are for the next 5 years, because there have been some conversations without any thought to the fact that we have no more room at City Hall. And most of us could hire a couple people to help us with our workload, but for the fact that there's no place for them to sit. And so that's what that's going to be about. We have a couple different scenarios to look at with the buildings that we own. With city council, we'll share that with them on the 18th. On February 25th, council has proposed a special council workshop. And I don't know if those of you are aware that at the February 4th meeting, we had a whole concept about library and community center in Town Square. And so they want to have a special workshop on that on February 25th. And hopefully with as we share what's happening, what the needs are for our city facilities and city staffing, that will get folded into that conversation. We are trying to schedule, date to be determined, a city council retreat to talk about funding strategies for city facilities and really go through, spend some dedicated time to figure out how we get there. So that's coming up, and that's really important because this is going to be certainly a significant part of looking at the 20-year capital facilities plan, is figuring out that process and what that looks like. Parks, Recreation and Open Space Plan. So we're because of the whole funding question for city facilities, we feel like it's really important that we break this into 2 phases. So the first phase is we're about to, SCJ Alliance did a great proposal. We actually went out in December. For late November and December, we had an RFP. We had 6 proposers, great proposals. We reviewed them. We narrowed it down to a short list of 3 for interviews. SCJ, Jen Dial and Chris Overbrook knocked it out of the ballpark. And so we're bringing this forward on Tuesday. They're going to go through inventory and assessment. They have a pretty robust public engagement plan. They're gonna cover demand and needs assessment, and then goals and policies, and really the level of service analysis that we need. This is stuff that we need for the comp plan. So the second phase will then look at again, integrating what we did in the first phase, and really involving some more public engagement as we develop the capital improvement plan for our parks, and also look at the capital facilities plan. And this is key to developing a financial plan for how we're going to get there. And so right now, as looking at the schedule, we really do get this across the finish line by the end of the year, which is good, because that's about the time we have to plug it into that 20-year capital facilities plan. So as for the transportation network and analysis, I just wanted to share with you, we have contract approval happening March 4th, where they're pulling together the scope and agreement right now as we speak. We've talked about the public engagement. We found that when we did this back in 2020, and we had virtual open houses because we had to, but it actually was a great format for the transportation network analysis, and we got really good participation. So we are looking at doing a couple virtual open houses as we develop the network analysis, which is again looking at taking the housing and land use pieces and plugging it into our transportation network to see what that means in the next 20 years for transportation improvements. We actually are going to do a story map, which is something that makes it, we've done a couple already, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but the story map is a really great opportunity for you to kind of take a deep dive into what's there, kind of understand what different scenarios might look like, etc. And it's a great thing to post on the website. We'll also be doing agency coordination with Spokane Valley, Spokane County, SRTC, and WashDOT on this. And our target completion date for this is October of this year. So it's going to take some time. We're looking at gathering some multimodal data, including some pretty robust truck data, which will help with, as we look at designing roadways, will help with design standards for our collectors and arterials, understanding what the truck volume is. We're looking at pedestrian and bike. Also, we'll have pedestrian and bike counts as well at the key intersections. We are going to do we're involved with Spokane Valley with the sub-area transportation plan right now. We haven't seen, I think they've just finished the existing conditions, and we have not yet seen it. We should be having a meeting shortly to see that. We will be using some of the counts that they already took and seasonally adjusting them, but we're going to have some overlapping counts so that we can use that for calibration purposes to calibrate their data. So it's going to be, I'm pretty stoked about this. It's going to be great information for the bike ped as well as for our transportation. And this is really going to take us a long way in terms of our transportation chapter. So that's, we do continue to work on that. Also, I just wanted to share with you a little bit of the public engagement we've already done and the public engagement that's coming forward. So I know it's a lot to cover, but we had a kickoff meeting in October, a virtual kickoff meeting in November. Had a presentation before Liberty Lake Rotary Club on November 19th. Our climate policy action team met for the first time at the end of January. We've got a building and energy stakeholder meeting that was on January 29th, and the climate element workshop for transportation on the 30th of January.
Can you go back?
Sure.
The transportation, there were 4 attendees.
Yeah, we had 4. Yes, we had 4 attendees plus staff. So SRTC came down with COVID, so they weren't there. But it was a really very robust discussion. It actually probably, we got,
Was it recorded?
no, it was not. These are stakeholders. It's not a public meeting.
Got it.
But we got really robust conversation. Good, WashDOT was there. WashDOT was there. I'm sorry, my brain is fried.
That's
right
okay,
now.
that's
But
okay.
we had, it was a very good conversation.
I'd like to. Is there any way I can get some kind of a feel for what was discussed and what were any conclusions from that meeting?
Well,
Or am I,
it will be coming. It will be coming.
okay.
So, we've been doing flyers. We just updated our QR code because the company that did our QR code went belly up, so we needed to do another QR code. We had an article in the Splash. We've been doing meetings with Rotary, the kickoff. We have, this is a picture from our CPAT meeting and we have a teacher and 6 of her students that are on our climate planning action team. And so,
And our
really
next meeting
great.
will be at
feedback.
Ridgeline High School.
Yes, then that's correct. We've also done some story maps. Lance developed a story map related to annexation in UGA, and it's a pretty cool one. And we've got that posted on our website. He also is working on a cultural and historic resource story map. And we have a story map for exploring Liberty Lake's climate element. Pretty cool. These are all on our website. We are going to start with the annexation because it's simple. Meeting with Community Engagement Commission next week. And we're going to talk about pushing these out with a survey on Zen City to try and engage people and get some feedback on some of this stuff. So we're going to start with annexation. The history and cultural resource will be next. We'll do the climate element, and we've got a few more engagements coming up. So we've got our climate resiliency workshop on February 19th. That's a stakeholder meeting. We're going to the Selkirk Career Fair. We've created this website scavenger hunt with our little flyers with the QR code to get the kids to go there. If they complete the scavenger hunt, they'll be entered into a drawing for VIP seats at the 4th of July celebration. Anyhow, so that's so we're excited about that. That may be something that we actually, so it's going to be a drawing for everybody who completes it, but we might even take that to farmers market as well. We have also a sign code stakeholder meeting on February 26th. You'll be doing the workshop with them following that, but we've got a great group of stakeholders for that. Land capacity analysis has been distributed to the water and sewer purveyors, Central Valley School District, Avista, PD, Spokane Valley Fire District, Consolidated Irrigation, Spokane County Environmental. So that's all out there. And we've asked them to take a look at it, look at capacity, be reaching out to them in a couple of months to meet with them. And we're hoping to schedule workshops in the summer with you guys to have that conversation about, do you have the capacity? So that is something that we are working on. And we're working on ideas for engagement activities at farmers market this summer, as well as I'm sure we'll be at Barefoot in the Park and some other of the community events, maybe movie nights, etc. So I just wanted you to know that we do have a lot of plates spinning right now, but we are pushing this out as best we can, and we're trying to get more and more creative on how we can push out the information and get people involved. We're in early sausage making right now. We have to do a little sausage making before we can kind of ask people to taste what it is that we're sample some of our ideas, right? So, but we're working to get there. So that's all I've got on updates for you. I will share with you, and I won't go through it, but I will share with you. We're going to have a busy schedule next time with sign code and with the next housing policy conversation. As I said, we'll probably do another one. Following that, because I think it's a lot, this is one of the bigger pieces of this comp plan. We are also in the process of working on various chapters to try and clean them up a little bit, streamline them a little bit, and kind of just in preparation as in red line format to bring back to you to talk about some of the goals and policies, et cetera. So we're in the throes of it right now. So that's my story.
All right, we're up to citizen comments. Do we have any citizens online? All right, we will move on to Secretary's report.
Yeah, so I just wanted to share a couple things with you. We have updated this. Once again, I promise you, it's going to change every time as we're drilling down more and more on each of these separate parts and pieces, and we're figuring out schedules. We had a call with Commerce on our climate resiliency chapter. And we wanted to find out one of the things that we had the option of submitting the greenhouse gas sub-element for Commerce review and approval. But it required, originally we understood it was a 120-day review. It's actually a 6-month review. However, if we do that, if we go through that process, if we get sued, which what that looks like is they take us to the Growth Management Board, Commerce will defend us. So we figured that since we're guinea pigs, I want it on their dime and not on the taxpayers' dime. So we kind of stepped up our pace a little bit so that we could be submitting that greenhouse gas sub-element to Commerce in August to make the deadline work, to make the whole thing work. I do have an update for you all in terms of the Commerce or the legislation for extending our comp plan deadline to December 31st of 2026. That hit the floor and it went to hearing. I don't have time to listen to the hearings, but I'm hoping that it went well. But that seems to be wending its way through the legislature. So with any luck, we'll have a little bit of a reprieve. Doesn't mean we're going to necessarily change our schedule because I'm still waiting for things. Things will blow up. Things are going to take longer than we think. And I think housing is going to be one of them. So we'll just do everything we can to get done as quickly as we can. And if we have more time to do the development code piece of it, it's a grand thing.
Now, everything takes longer than it takes.
It's a true story.
Is that it?
That is it.
Planning Commissioner reports. Any reports, commissioners? Our next meeting is February 26th. I'll hear a motion for adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Is there a second? All in favor?
I
Aye. Thank you.
Thank you all.